Welcome to the Meant to Be Outdoors podcast, where our goal is to connect listeners to the great outdoors, with hosts Brian Hoffmeyer and Ben Brandell.
I'm host Ben Brandell, owner of Meant to Be Outdoors, instructor of outdoor skills, and passionate about personal growth.
I'm host Brian Hoffmeyer, wildlife biologist and avid outdoorsman. Welcome back to another episode of the Meant to Be Outdoors podcast. It is time for another Myth Monday episode. Ben and Brian here, and today we are talking about fire starting tools to be exact. And the myth we really want to address is about fire starters, tools used to start fires. We love to teach these classes. It's probably one of our most popular classes, and we hear these called the wrong thing all the time. To be specific, we want to address that a ferro rod is not flint and steel, right, Ben?
That is correct.
So we watch TV. We love to watch, Alone, Survivor, Dual Survivor. There's all these survivor shows and outdoor skill shows on TV. It's very popular in magazines if you're still old school and read magazines like we do. Even you can go to the store and shop for some of these products, and some of them are, I don't know if they're labeled wrong. I mean, people can really call them whatever they want as they're selling a product, but it's not truly what they are. They'll even label some of them wrong. So if we're going to be talking about flint and steel and ferro rods, let's go ahead and jump in and really define each one and explain the differences, and then we'll kind of talk about how we use them. So I'm going to throw it to you. What the heck is flint and steel? Because when I watch Survivor, huge Survivor fan, over 40 seasons, old Jeff wants to talk about, I'm going to take your flint and steel. You win this challenge, I'm going to give you your flint and steel back. It's not flint and steel. It drives me crazy. So what is real flint and steel?
So let's go back. Yeah, when we talk about tools for fire starting, you have your friction, you have your percussion. To even today, we have solar and the crazy side of chemical. So,
and we're not talking about lighter fluid or lighters here. We know everybody knows what those are, knows how to use them. We will talk a little bit about a lighter, but
right. And so, kind of looking back, going back in time, the very first, it used to be called the first match, which was flint and steel. Before flint and steel came, the bow drill, your friction fires, the natives here in North America would have used all friction. There was no iron yet. There was no steel production. It would have been just that, friction.
And we teach that too, but you want to get a group of people frustrated, try to teach them friction fire, because it's not easy, my man.
It isn't. It is a lot of fun, though. It's a good workout.
You need a little physical endurance.
And when you're able to achieve your ember from a bow drill, it's very rewarding.
Oh my gosh, it is a good feeling after you catch your breath.
Yeah, after you
go
lay
away,
down and take
a
nap. Yeah. But yeah, after the friction, then we get into that percussion side, which is the flint and steel. So the original match, before there was ever anything called a match.
How far back? You're saying original. How far back we going here?
They're talking 700 BC to 40 AD.
Gosh, that's wild. They think that they were working with metal all the way back then. 700 BC.
Right, and then that, as that had been before we started taking that up in North America.
So we're talking, this is all European.
Yeah. But getting into what we see today, which what you could go out and buy today online when we talk about flint and steel.
Walmart even.
Yeah, they may. Yeah. They may carry the steel portion.
Yep.
The flint, something you can find. That's what we're going to start breaking down right now. So what is flint and steel?
Especially here in the Ozarks, we can find it because we have so much limestone. But
right.
We'll get more into that.
Yeah. So flint and steel is going to literally be a piece of steel and a separate thing, which is a rock.
Literally a rock.
And back in the day, when you're talking about that type of steel, it had been a high carbon steel that created sparks, and so you wouldn't always have to use a flint rock. You wouldn't have to. It could be a hard rock that's got a sharp edge, but the flint rock or quartz, which inside that, bringing it down to get into silica, it keeps a very hard, sharp edge so that you can reuse that flint rock over and over and over.
You're talking something similar to like what Native Americans would have made their tools out of, arrowheads.
Yeah, arrowheads.
The flint napping, that skill is
correct.
We're talking about this quartz or flint.
Yes.
That has that high silica content.
Yes, and that's a great rock to use. And I'm going to say it one more time. You can use any kind of rock you find because it's the actual steel. You do have to find, a high carbon steel. It can't just be
Yeah, but
I
it
try to
can't
pipe.
be any rock, because if it's a soft rock, you're not going to peel away that steel.
Correct.
It has to be a hard type of sedimentary rock.
Yes, and honestly, a sharp edge is going to create that higher spark. But it is the steel that's actually that you are turning into a melted piece of fire. I mean, as it's cutting it.
So if you have priority between the rock and the steel that you're using, it's the high carbon steel that's more priority than the rock, but you're still going to have to find the right kind of rock to
Correct.
use.
Yeah, and that's kind of the whole point there is you can carry that around, but you're going to have to find something to strike it with. And so having those two, that's your flint and your steel. And that's
Right.
what they used to carry around. They'd usually keep their steel separate from their flint. A lot of times you would keep your flint and your tinder, which we haven't talked about tinder yet, but your tinder, that would be dry. It's what you're going to catch the spark in.
Right.
You know, they would keep that flint and tinder together and keep their steel separate.
Right.
But
And it was great because it was waterproof. I mean,
Yeah.
you can keep those things wet. When you're talking about the steel, this high carbon steel, just so everybody understands, we're not talking about steel that's plated. So we're not talking about stainless steel or chrome plated steel, any of that stuff that's really shiny. Think more raw, high carbon steel. Even we've tried, what's the rods they use in construction? My mind's blanking.
rebar.
Rebar, yeah, we've tried
rebar.
rebar before, and it's not high carbon steel, so you're not going to be able to shave that off and get a high heat spark off of that.
Right, and that's correct. And it is about the steel, which that kind of leads us then kind of moving into what we see today. So when we're talking about the steel, what you're actually doing is you're cutting and scraping little bits of that steel off with a sharp edge of the flint. That's what flint and steel is. And then the misnomer is getting into what Jeff Probst and what people are throwing in today,
Right.
which is different. It is different than the early days of making fire after friction.
So if we're really comparing ferro rods and flint and steel here, we've really talked about, defined, I think, pretty well. Hopefully everyone has an understanding now of what true flint and steel is, dating back to 700 BC. Now let's define what a ferro rod is, because most people have probably seen these either be used or seen them in the camping aisle at Walmart or one of our sporting goods stores. We carry them. We love to carry them in backpacks, and we teach with them. We love them. But let's define what a ferro rod is.
So for short today, we're going to be saying ferro rods. Brian, start off by talking about ferro rods. That full name is ferrocerium.
Ferrocerium.
But it is several different rare earth metals.
Yeah.
And as they combine them, which one that people would know would be magnesium would be in there. And as you take a sharp edge and you literally strike it, run it down the edge of that, you are creating the same concept. It's creating sparks.
Yep.
Now
Hot sparks, 5,000
sparks.
degree sparks if you're doing it correctly.
Right, when you do it correctly, they're going to tell you that the heat from that's bouncing, that bead, that hot bead is going to be around 5,000 degrees. And so that today there are many brands out there that are making this product, but that is not flint and steel. That is something completely different.
Right. So kind of what he's talking about, this mix of metals is what a ferro rod is, mish metals, however you want to say it. The general recipe, it's going to vary by manufacturer because, again, they're trying to get the best, the easiest one to strike, the hottest spark, because they want you to buy it, right? They want to have the best one. But generally, this is kind of the recipe of metals that makes a ferro rod. So we're talking about 50% cerium, 25% lanthanum, 19% iron, and then there's small amounts of praseodymium, neodymium, and then that magnesium that you talk about. All those metals come together to truly make ferrocerium, which is the full term for these blended metals. Ferro rod is the common name, and that is spelled Ferro. That's going to be what we refer to when we say ferro rod. When you go to the store and you say, hey, do you have ferro rods? That's what they're going to take you to find. So we've kind of described what a ferro rod is. Now let's talk about what it looks like. So this is a podcast. You can't see us, but you can hear us. We have put up some pictures and some videos of how we use these and what they are on our social media accounts. You can go look at those if you need to. But a ferro rod, basically when you're going to find it in the store, you're going to have a small lanyard. If you were to cut it and lay it out, it's probably maybe a foot long, but it's tied together or clipped together. And on that lanyard, you have the actual ferro rod, which is, small pencil diameter. We'll say maybe like an ink pen or smaller diameter, and it's going to be, 3 or 4 inches. You can buy big ones that are 6 inches long. The bigger they are, the more strikes they have in them. But you're going to have the rod. Sometimes it'll have a little gripper handle on the end of it. And then on the other end of that string, you're going to have the striker, which is usually just a little piece of metal, but something that you can take to that rod and scrape and make sparks to try to light your fire with.
When you're talking about brands, that's actually pretty critical to have a great striker.
Yeah, the striker is more important almost than the rod.
Right, and if that striker's not sharp, it doesn't create that spark very well off of that.
Yeah,
that
we've
ferro
had
rod.
some we thought were great, and then 100 strikes in, the striker's done. They're not very good, and we've taken old strikers that we like that rods are worn out and tried to pair them to other rods because the striker is pretty critical.
Right, and that is a one-piece thing. So, I mean, when you're searching on Amazon, going to any, I actually saw them in a local hardware store.
Wow.
So that was new. I was like, great, everyone's starting to carry them.
Yeah, and you can also just buy the ferro rod. Some people just carry the ferro rod because they know they're going to have a knife.
So if you were to Google this right now, most of the videos you're going to find, if you were to type in how to make a ferro rod, I'm going to say 99% of those videos are how to put that rod that's already pre-made into a handle. And most people are like, want to make a birch handle and a plastic handle. And
which is cool, but you don't even have to have it.
No, you don't have to have that handle. And I don't know how to actually make it. If I knew how to make a ferro rod,
I just gave you the recipe.
I
Can't
know.
you get all those
if I
metals
could go
and
collect
melt
all
them
that
down?
and smash her together, but
Do some schmelting.
But most of those videos, again, it's just putting a handle on it, and you don't have to have that, just like you said.
Right. But and even your knife blade, it does have to be the right kind of knife blade. I know those knives that we teach with in all our classes, you can't strike a ferro rod with them. So
Like on the back of them.
Right, on the spine of your knife blade.
Right.
You do have to have
Something
the right kind of knife blade, so make sure
edged.
you're testing that knife if that's what you plan to be your striker.
And then talking about like with Jeff Prost and kind of debunking these, or not debunking, but really talking through what is what,
The show survivor.
the show Survivor always comes to my mind because every year I watch it, Jeff started moving into where he throws. Like he's starting to throw these things that, here you go, here's your flint and steel. And again, it's not flint and steel. What he's actually throwing to them.
I've never even heard a contestant correct him.
I know.
No producer, no contestant. Do they truly not know, or are they just calling it that because...
Maybe they're so wrapped up in the moment. Who wants to call him out anyway?
I guess you're right, yeah.
But as he throws it to them, what he's throwing them, every one that I've ever seen, and in the multiple seasons I have watched, it's a magnesium block. Mm-hmm. And on the side of that, which I can't see this, but if you go buy a magnesium block, most of the time there's going to be a ferro rod on the side of it. And so there's a difference there now, because magnesium does not start our fire. It's going to be it's not going to be our heat source. It's going to be our fuel.
Yeah, so if you've watched Survivor, what he's talking about, it's a little, it's probably 3 inches long and an inch or two wide. It's literally a little silver block, and then it just looks like a little silver metal block, but it is not flint, and that's not a ferro rod. That is actually just magnesium.
Correct. And
what's the point of it? What do they use that for?
Well, so you have your fire triangle. A fire has to have oxygen, fuel, and heat. Mm-hmm. So what he is giving them is both heat and fuel.
Okay.
The ferro rods we were talking about is just a heat source. Flint and steel is just a heat source unless you start carrying your tinder. Tinder
Gotcha.
is the very first step of fuel. So when we talk about fuel,
small, light, fluffy stuff.
It's light, fluffy stuff. To give you an example of a great one that we make, cotton ball. When I say we make, I'm saying we manufacture that. We pull it from the plant, we dye it, we clean it. It comes out in a big bag.
Not we as meant to be outdoors, but we
Correct.
as humans. Yeah, we as a society.
Yes. So that cotton ball, when we get in the primitive side, you and I use a lot of cedar bark. Mm-hmm. You can really smash that down, rub that around, and make it fluffy. And that's a great source of tinder. After kindling, you add kindling. But again,
I'm always open for destroying a cedar.
I know that breaks my heart. I love cedars because they're so awesome for fire.
They're just not great wildlife habitat, so I'm always down to get rid of them.
But I'm fine with you cutting them because once they're dead and dry, they're even
dry
better.
bark, yeah.
That's right. But back to this though, the magnesium side is your fuel. That is the fuel source that you. So when you watch that show or anybody using it, you would be taking your knife. A lot of times they come with a saw, a little mini saw that you can use for your striker, and also begin to cut and get pieces, many flakes of that magnesium into a pile.
Yeah, I think that's most apparent in the show So when they get down to the final 3 and there's the 2 the pick to do the fire challenge,
Mm-hmm.
it really shows their fire starting skills the best. So they both start by scraping this block. They're scraping it, and they're not trying to make sparks. They are trying to get that magnesium, those flakes off of there as their tinder, and then they're going to flip that rod over to where the ferro rod is. Now they're going to have their heat source and create those sparks that hopefully is going to hit all the magnesium flakes. It's going to flare up and then catch their natural material, the organic coconut husk.
Yeah, when they
to
say
light
that
their
the
fire.
coconut husk, that would be your first stage of fuel, which is tinder, and that's what they're using first. And as they begin to add their sticks, you're getting into your kindling, and that's all they do because you don't want a sustainable fire.
Right.
Yeah, add fuel wood, which is your third, if you wanted a sustainable fire to.
So I just
cook
want to
on.
be very clear here because this is one that drives me nuts. On Survivor, they use a magnesium block with a ferro rod on the side. They do not, never have, probably never will use flint and steel. But you do now know what true flint and steel is because we've described it. And we'll keep talking about it a little more here as we share some of our stories. So we love ferro rods. You've probably gotten that by listening to us talk about them here. And obviously we're doing a podcast about them, so we have a little passion there. I mentioned earlier, our survival fire course is probably our most desired or most booked. People love to take that. We teach it. We've taught it from kindergartners all the way up now. It's about that 8-9 years old when there's the dexterity and strength that they can start to kind of use a ferro rod. But even on up into adults, people love learning how to use these. We carry them in all of our backpacks. There's so many benefits of them. My favorite is that they're waterproof. I could throw this off of my boat, dive down, get it, bring it back up, and light a fire with it. And
Correct.
if you were ever in a survival situation, whether you're hiking, camping, backpacking, whatever, to be able to have a foolproof fire starter like that, as long as you know how to use it and have that skill, that's really valuable.
Well, that's why I love it the most and carry it everywhere with me. And almost in every backpack I have a ferro rod, and I usually have a ferro rod on me every day.
Yeah.
It just, whether it be in a bracelet, might be a tiny size, whatever, I usually carry one. And that's because your fail rate is super low. So out of all the devices out there, I can create a fire pretty quickly, especially with the skill and the practice and getting better and better. I can make a fire really quickly with a ferro rod, and it's a low fail rate. Like
Right.
when I put pressure down on that with a blade or my striker or sharp edge, I'm going to get sparks. And now I got to catch them with that tinder, but the fail rate's very low. That's why I love it so much. So that's why it can get wet and still be usable. Heat, it doesn't matter if it's hot, cold, it doesn't matter. It's
Yeah.
almost always going to produce a spark when you.
Yeah, and it's not copyrighted or proprietary or anything, so why don't we share with them kind of the basic steps of how we would, if somebody were to walk in here right now, how we would show them how to use a ferro rod.
So when you have a ferro rod, I hold the ferro rod in my non-dominant hand.
Right.
And then I want to use what we call a striker. Could be a piece of metal, could be the back of a knife, could be the knife blade. You got to be careful when you're getting into something that sharp. I'm going to hold that in my dominant hand. Mm-hmm. And when we're teaching this, it does depend on the type of striker you use, but you want to keep that angle very, very low, almost keeping your striker flat, And as you're keeping that flat, you're going to press forward and roll your wrist. Mm-hmm. And as you roll that wrist, that begins to really dig into that ferro rod.
You are peeling this ferrocerium off of this rod. You're literally trying to peel it off of there as you're striking.
Yeah, which, to kind of give the opposite example, the flint and steel, that's what you're doing too, but you're using that flint rock to peel a piece of that high carbon steel off to create that spark. But that heat is still not as hot as a ferro rod is.
Right. Mm-hmm. But and it's not this high impact where you're knocking these two things together with a ferro rod. It's more of this, you're making contact with your striker and your rod.
Yeah.
You're pressing up with one hand, down with the other, a lot of pressure. Because the harder you press and the more power you have, that's going to be a higher degree spark that you throw. So when you start to throw sparks, it's pretty easy to throw some sparks. But if they're not falling and bouncing on the ground or over the table or whatever it is that you're lighting over on the rocks, they're not the super hot 5,000 degree ones. They're more 1,500, 2,000 degrees. And it's going to be really hard to light, especially natural tinder with those. You can maybe light a nice fluffy cotton ball, but you've got to push and strike hard, get those bouncing sparks before you really have a good fire starter going there.
You do. And to go back, 'cause there is one more piece I need to add into flint and steel, because it's critical to have success. It's critical. It's going to lead to success. So what I mean is, when we talked about flint and steel, that is your heat source, but you have to have your tinder. But if you go out and find a natural tinder, we talked about cedar earlier as our natural tinder, our natural fuel. You almost have to create what's called char cloth or char rope, because when we're talking flint and steel, that little spark is not high heat, and it has to catch and begin to, I'll just say, burn on something, right? Grow on something. And so that's when you're creating char cloth. Now, what is char cloth? You are basically, here's how we would make it. So when we're teaching this fire, when we're describing these things, if you take an Altoids
tin can. A tin, square tin, yeah.
Square tin.
We also have used, we've bought before the gift card tins.
Yeah, gift card tins. Yeah. Something like that. You're going to place cotton in it. Has to be cotton.
We cut up old T-shirts, typically.
We do. Bandanas, any of those things. Mm-hmm. And you're going to create a pinhole, very tiny hole.
And you're just going to cut them into little, like, 1x1 squares.
Yeah. You're going to cut them in squares so they have multiple pieces of char, whatever. We're calling it char cloth. You can also do this with cotton rope. So types of rope, you can make char rope. But you do have to use a piece of char cloth. And so by putting that I'm going to say a pin-size hole in it, you're going to place it directly on the fire. Now, I have done this on my stove before.
So where are you putting the hole here, this pin-size hole?
I usually put it on the top of the can, but if you're wanting it waterproof, you may hide it under the lid on the side. Right. Check out YouTube, all kinds of great ideas out there.
There's going to be some pressure and some heat that builds up in there.
Yeah.
So if you don't do that, then your lid's going to pop off and you're done.
Yeah, you have to release some of that pressure, but you don't want very much oxygen, because you want it to leave behind the carbon.
Tiny hole.
And so it's a tiny hole. And what you're watching for as it's on the fire is you're going to be watching that hole, and you're going to begin to see all kinds of, I'm going to call it smoke.
Yeah, it's smoke.
I know, but it almost looks like water vapor coming out in a way. And once that stops, I usually leave it on a little longer, but then you're going to take that off and let it cool. So once you don't see anything else coming out of the hole, it's almost done.
Yeah, so after the smoke stops coming out of the hole, you're going to take your tin out of the fire. Once it cools down, you can open that tin and you'll have little black pieces of cotton, and there'll still be enough fiber there left to burn, but they're going to catch so much easier than the raw cotton would have been.
Correct.
And we now know that you have to have that when you're using flint and steel, because the sparks are cooler. So let's get back to our ferro rods and our love for them and how we teach with them. So Ben was saying that you've got to have this striker in your dominant hand. So for us, we're both right-handed. We're going to have the striker in our right hand. We're going to put the ferro rod in our non-dominant hand. And usually when we're teaching people, we've got just they're like aluminum cake pans, I guess. Mm-hmm. You can buy them at Sam's in a pack of 30, but aluminum baking dish, and we fluff up cotton balls. You got to fluff them up because you want to add some oxygen in there. They're a lot easier to light. And then we're going to go ahead and let them strike. And if they master that, we kind of have a progression that we go through through that. But we love to teach with them, starting 8-9 years old up to adults, because it is such a great thing to have, and a great way to have a foolproof fire starter. But you do have to practice and have the skill. It's hard to just be handed one to go use it. So I don't know. I feel like we've done a pretty good job describing what each of those are. I want to know, what was your awakening of your introduction, I guess, to ferro rods and the difference between flint and steel? Little Ben story here.
Yeah, mine would have come, thinking back, it would have been in college. And
so like 40 years ago.
Not 40 years ago. I'm just trying to think of his name, and I don't remember him, but he was a classmate of mine. I know that he was in the ROTC at the time, and we were doing a leadership trip. And so that's exactly when it was. We were out paddling. It was during a 4-day paddling trip, and he was kind of a minimalist, which in those days I didn't know what that meant.
Right.
When I went backpacking or paddling, I took everything. The kitchen sink. I even took a cooker that had a baking pan. I could bake in. I just took everything. And he was a minimalist, and he had this small North Face backpack. And that's it. Like, he had everything he needed in it for this 4-day trip, and I was blown away. And I remember we we got to camp one night, and he's like, "Hey, I'll start a fire for us," and he pulled out what is now what we're talking about, a ferro rod.
Yeah.
And I was blown away, which I'd never seen them before, hadn't heard of them. I'd heard of Flint and Steel. You'll learn that in some of the scouts programs and stuff, but I'd never heard of this, never seen this thing.
Right.
And so for him to use it, get a fire going, I was amazed. I'm like, and I actually would, thinking through this was probably the start of my mentalist journey of what can I start leaving at home and using that's more efficient.
Well, that's really good, yeah. And actually, my introduction would have been you. So as we were working together as conservation instructors, we were teaching mostly children, these groups of kids, but I was still under that whole Flint and Steel thing. I'm like, oh, is that some kind of modern Flint and Steel? And you really showed me how to use both. But it really hit me the difference the first time you gave me actual Flint and Steel and said, well, try this now that you've done a ferro rod, because I still didn't really understand what the difference was. And when I went out with basically it's a piece of steel and it wraps around your knuckles. It's made for fire starting.
It kind of looks like brass knuckles.
Yeah, kind of like brass knuckles.
The way they make them today.
Perfect example, yeah. And my rock, and I'm trying to light this cotton ball with this. It is so much more difficult, Ben. It is so much more difficult. It's more dangerous. I was busting my knuckles on both hands.
Well, let's talk about it. I told you that before you started. I said, be careful, because remember we talked earlier that if you're using actual flint rock, that's a hard, sharp edge. So you're basically holding a knife sideways in your hand.
And as you strike it, it gets sharper, or all of a sudden you may bust a big piece off and you have to kind of rotate that rock in your hand to find that nice sharp edge.
Because now you're actually napping it.
Yeah.
So you're creating the arrowheads back. Anyway.
But that was my realization of, okay, there's no way these are the same thing. They're totally different. And that's when I kind of, started asking you questions and really diving in so that I could teach. And
because when you take that piece of char cloth we just talked about, and you either have to place it below the flint rock or above. And as you're beginning to then bring your knuckles with your steel over your knuckles, and you're striking that down, you're hitting along that rock, perpendicular to that rock, you've got to catch that itty bitty tiny spark onto that piece of char cloth, either above or below. And very difficult. It
is. You can sit there and make 2,000 sparks, and not a one's going to hit your little char cloth. So it is tough, and there's tactics. Some people will even hold that char cloth and their lower fingers between their pinky and all that, so it's landing on there. There's all kinds of different things, but we have ferro rods, so who cares about flint and steel? We don't need it anymore, right?
Hip, hip, hooray, yes.
Hip, hooray. Some of you may be saying, who cares about a ferro rod? Because we have lighters, Ben and Brian. Well, Ben, why don't you share with everybody what makes a lighter spark?
It's funny you say that. I have been asked before, why do you carry a ferro rod instead of a lighter?
Yeah.
So the irony in that is that inside the lighter is a micro ferro rod. And I say micro because it is tiny, tiny, tiny. And so that's what they've taken. That's where this really all started from Flint and Steel, getting into then, actually it'd be a match. They started getting matches to then bringing that ferro rod into the scene, which was in our lighters.
Right.
And so this itty bitty ferro rod that's in there creates that spark. So there's our heat source. When you're talking about a lighter, you have your fuel already in there. But when we talk about survival, most of the scenarios you give is that you have a lighter that's punctured, it's out of fuel, or it's just not working. So when you talk about why I would rather have a ferro rod versus a lighter, is because that ferro rod I talked earlier about it, it's a minimal fail rate. You can take that itty bitty ferro rod out of that cigarette lighter and try to use it, but it is so tiny that it's just too tiny. So carrying a ferro rod is better for me. It stays waterproof. I don't have to worry about the fuel, leaking the fuel, all of those things.
Yeah, it's not going to... you can smash a lighter and they'll almost like blow up. So you don't have that risk with a ferro rod at all, because it's literally just...
I've left them in the sun, they've been carried all through wintertime. They're awesome.
Right. I think you've even got it on an airplane or two with one on your bracelet on your wrist a few times.
Well, if you look up your flight, what's allowed or not, back when I was flying, they didn't say you couldn't carry it, so I definitely had one in my backpack.
Yeah. Which is wild. Hopefully they've caught onto that by now.
Maybe not.
Well, we've shared with you guys there is a huge difference between a ferro rod and flint and steel. So hopefully next time you guys hear flint and steel used, you're going to ask yourself, is that really flint and steel that you're using? Because most of the time you're going to find out that it's not. Hopefully, our introductions to ferro rods have been an inspiration to you. So now that you know what they are, we hope you go introduce yourself to ferro rods. That's it for this episode of the Myth Monday podcast. We hope between now and our next episode that you find time to get outdoors. Thank you for listening to the Meant to Be Outdoors podcast, hosted by Brian Hoffmeyer and Ben Brandell. Please help us by subscribing. Also, follow along on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook.